Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our event tonight, which is on the media's coverage of the Japanese incarceration, some of the blunders that were made at that time, and how that sort of plays out here in the modern era. And before I get off the stage, I want to say, first of all, if you haven't joined AAJA, the Asian American Journalists Association, please do join. And also, if you get a chance, please visit our Facebook page and website, the Facebook page for AAJA LA. We try to make it a bit of a news center for Asian American affairs on the West Coast and beyond. And with that, I'm going to introduce Ann Burroughs, the director and CEO of Japanese American National Museum.
Thank you. So if you're not members of the Japanese American National Museum, I would encourage you all to be members. So my role this evening is to welcome you all. We're very pleased to have you here. We're very pleased to be able to present this program to you tonight. We're also delighted to be working with our partners and co-sponsors, and those are the Asian American Journalists Association, the Los Angeles Times, and Asian Americans Advancing Justice. So, you know, there are many reasons. We have a fantastic panel. We have an amazing program. We also have a short video for you this evening. But I did want to spend just a couple of moments talking to you about what I think is really one of the most moving and extraordinary exhibitions that I have seen, and I'm very glad that we're here just across the plaza in the museum itself. We have an exhibition called Instructions to All Persons, which is an exhibition that commemorates the 75th anniversary of Executive Order 9066, that saw the incarceration of almost 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry. It's extraordinary in many ways, not least because it's one of the sort of core issues, one of the most important, probably one of the, I don't want to say, but certainly one of the most important events in the history of Japanese Americans, and certainly in the history of this country. But, you know, you look at that order, you look at the executive order, we had 2 pages of the original order. I'm not sure whether the final page has gone back to the National Archive, but one of the pages is the final page, which has President Roosevelt's signature on it. And you look at that document, and it is, I mean, in many senses, you just look at the document in a case, unless you know what it is, unless you read what it is, unless you understand what the context is, you look at that document and it's typed on, 1942 government issue typewriter. But you look at that signature, and President Roosevelt's signature is there, and you look at the flick of that pen, just that slight flick of the pen. You look at that, you see that, and it's so hard to comprehend what the consequences of that one executive order would be on the history of this country, and of what the consequences were for Japanese Americans, how families were broken up, how communities were broken up, and how generations succeeding, how that's influenced the lives of succeeding generations. And of course, why it's important for us now, because when we look back into the eye of history and we look at that document, we look at that executive order, and when we're in this current climate of, executive orders popping up at one point on an almost daily basis. But you look at that one particular order and you see the devastating consequences of that corrosive power of prejudice and discrimination. You understand how damaging, how seriously damaging, how devastating public policy is when it's shaped by the politics of bigotry and failed political leadership. So fast forward 75 years, we have to look at the environment that we're in now. We have to compare that. We have to look back into the eye of history and look at the environment that allowed something like that to happen. And what we're going to be doing tonight, and I think in a very, very powerful way, we have an extraordinary panel But we will be looking at the role of the media and their responsibility and their culpability in creating that climate that was conducive to allowing Executive Order 9066. And of course, we will be looking at the role of the media in the way that they've covered the elections and in a way that they have covered some of the policy issues. But also, we'll be looking at the role of the media in the run-up to the election. And again, to what extent were they culpable? To what extent were they propagating fake news? To what extent were they enabling the kind of climate that we live in now? To what extent were they enabling that to happen? And I think that the other question that we'll be asking ourselves in the panel is, in 1942, the media was part of creating that environment as being normal. And I think we also have to look at the role that the media has played in sort of, for some people anyway, creating what we have now as being normal. We're going to start our program off on a short video. It's about a 8 to 10 minute video. It's been made by our Watasi Media Arts Center, by our media team. And it features quotes from the Los Angeles Times and the Hearst newspapers from 1942, from the lead up to 1942, around the time of the incarceration, and also some of the quotes from the last 2016. I think the most recent ones are in 2016. But I think what also makes this remarkable is the juxtaposition of those quotes, of those media stories, with clips from home movies from that time that we have in our own collection. So that's the first segment of our program, and I hope that you will find as much value in it as you will with the rest of the program. I'm sure you will. So thank you. So I would like to introduce our first speaker this evening. He's no stranger to most of us. Richard Reeves is a senior lecturer at the Annenberg School for Communication at USC. He's an author and syndicated columnist whose column has appeared in more than 100 newspapers since 1979. A few of the many titles that he's held throughout his illustrious career include Chief Political Correspondent for the New York Times, National Editor and Columnist for Esquire and the New York Magazine, and Chief Correspondent on Frontline. He's received dozens of awards for his work in print, television, and film, including an Emmy for the documentary Lights, Camera, Politics, which he produced for ABC News. He's published more than 20 books, including Infamy, the shocking story of the Japanese-American incarceration of World War II, which he presented here at JANM in November of 2015. So please welcome to the stage, to the podium.
Hi. I don't know whether you can tell by my voice or accent or whatnot, but I was born in New York, worked most of my life in New York if I wasn't overseas or in Washington. And if I was ever in a conversation, I was at the New York Herald Tribune, the New York Times, I don't ever remember having a conversation about what happened in the West during World War II. And I would also say that in doing the book, I did this book because in my younger days, I did a lot of skiing and driving north would pass the gatehouse there at Manzanar, and invariably someone would say, "Isn't that where they put the Japanese?" Well, it was one of the places, indeed, that they did. And I always thought it was a story that I should know more about and wanted to know more about, but life often gets in the way. And it wasn't until I realized that not only could it happen here, it did happen here, and it could happen here again. And it was the language of the last few years concerning immigrants, concerning border crossers, concerning Muslims, that made me feel I wanted to do my bit to try to prevent this from happening again, and also to maybe push the conversation a little toward the east, because I tell you that I could still go back to Manhattan and eat at the best tables, talk to the best people, and find out that they had never heard of the events of 1942, 43, 44. I want to start, obviously, with the role of the press, where I have spent most of my working years. I mean, other people, I assume, when we talk in the panel, will talk about some of the legalities involved. And of course, part of the reason that I decided to write the book was because I knew it could happen again, because as wiser people than I will tell you, it was never found to be unconstitutional. There were cases won by individuals, Korematsu, others, but the the government's power, government's power to create military zones and put anybody they want into them is still there, as Robert Jackson said in the 1940s, lying like a smoking gun on the Constitution. So, as many people here probably know better than I, there was institutionalized racism and suppression of many types of Americans, of Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, particularly out here. And so that, as you know, they were Japanese Americans. I'll say Japanese Americans. I wrote a book about Americans on both sides of the barbed wire. The people in the concentration camps were not Japanese. They were American, most of them. 70% of them were citizens, and the others, the older members of the community, were not. Of the 120,000 people who were rounded up, were not allowed to get citizenship after 1924. And in fact, Japanese Americans could not get citizenship again until 1952, unless they were born here. And so the prejudice was great, and one of the reasons, yes, it was race, yes, it was the unfamiliar. America has a history going back to the Native Americans, to the Africans, and now African Americans, the Tories, the Jews, the Irish need not apply, and all Catholics for a long time. And all of these people were both legally and illegally discriminated against and lived lives that were partly misery because of that. They were the other, and we would not accept them as us until they were us. There's an interesting, one of the themes that I followed in the book was my conclusion that the American tale, the tale of the founding fathers, all those smart guys in Philadelphia with the Whigs, and today still, for instance, on the Supreme Court, are talked about as the founders of the country. And indeed, they were the founders of the country, but they didn't build the country. In today's New York Times, there is an ad by the Anti-Defamation League promoting a little book. I've written a biography of John Kennedy and supposed to know a great deal about it. John Kennedy, while he was president, wrote a very short little book called A Nation of Immigrants, which told the story that I believe of how the country came to be the country and was built by these waves of immigrants. It was an act of faith that they came here, wave after wave after wave, Italians, Germans, Russians, and they were brought here, basically, as were the blacks, because we needed labor. The Chinese built the railroads. The Japanese Americans created industries in farming, in agriculture, in horticulture, in fishing in this country, and some of them, as I'm sure you know, were doing quite well. But again, they were the other, and they were resented by us until they were us. All of us, in one way or another, came in one of those waves of immigration, probably weren't accepted at the beginning, but by the time we became Americans, all of America, we were then we were accepted as us because we were us. We are the people in this room. So going to the racial prejudice first and how it was handled by the press, and it was pretty common, as I'm sure many people know, much more open than anything that we know much about today. This was, I saw a bit of this, the quote I'm going to read, which was in both the Los Angeles Times and the San Francisco Examiner, published by a writer named Henry McLemore, a syndicated columnist. And he wrote, speaking strictly as an American, I think Americans are nuts. The only Japanese apprehended here have been the ones the FBI actually had something on. The rest of them, so help me, are free as birds. I know this is the melting pot of the world and all men are created equal and there must be no such thing as race or creed hatred. But do these things go when a country is fighting for its life? I am for immediate removal of every Japanese on the West Coast to a point deep in the interior. I don't mean a nice part of the interior either. Personally, I hate the Japanese, and that goes for all of them. Let them be pitched, hurt, hungry, and dead up against it. That was written within a week of Pearl Harbor. One interesting thing, at least that I found, was that in the first 2 or 3 days after Pearl Harbor, most of the voices in the American press, and I'm speaking mostly the Western press, but also of papers like the New York Times and Washington Post, in the beginning were saying we're all Americans. It's not their, whoever they are, fault and whatnot, and we must remember what the principles of this country are. That lasted, I would say, about 3 days, at most a week, until you started to get the kind of things that McLemore wrote. And the Los Angeles Times here, one of our sponsors, ran front page headlines in that period after the Jap boat flashes messages ashore. Enemy planes sighted over California coast. Caps on Japanese tomato plants point to airfields. One of the myths, none of this was true. One of the myths had to do with the fact that Japanese owned or controlled a good deal of agricultural land, not the best agricultural land in California by any means, in places under power lines, near airfields, near military bases, land that nobody else wanted. That suddenly became seen as a fifth column plot to coordinate sabotage by Japanese Americans in the United States. And it began in that period. William Randolph Hearst, who owned the Los Angeles Examiner, the Examiner in San Francisco, wrote page one editorials under his own name and picture. And one of them in that period invited cabinet members and military men to travel west. Come see the myriads of little Japs peacefully raising fruits and flowers and vegetables on California sunshine and saying, hopefully and wistfully, someday I come with Japanese army and take all this. Yes, sir, thank you. Then see the fleets of peaceful little Japanese fishing boats plying up and down the California coast, catching fish and taking photographs. So that was the kind of buildup that there was in the popular press. The Sacramento Bee in an editorial, the necessity for action has been growing for the past 10 weeks as the possibility of a Japanese attack on the coast has loomed ever larger. Californians never can feel secure until all enemy aliens and fifth column citizens too are put in place and surrounded with conditions which will make it utterly impossible for them to serve superiors in any totalitarian capital whose deadly purpose is to destroy the United States of America. The press whipped up several groups of people, among them kind of civic organizations, which included the Lions, the Elks, the Masons, the California Townsend Clubs, the Magnolia Study Club of Anaheim, the Mutual Broadcasting Company's lead commentator, John Hughes, News and Views from John B. Hughes, was telling the nation day after day, East and West, that 99% of the Japanese alien and citizen were primarily loyal to Japan, a place many of them had never seen. Those are my words, not his. The Japanese are a far greater menace in our midst than any other Axis patriots. They will die joyously for the honor of Japan. And it was not only characters who could be as unsavory as Hearst and his writers who were spreading this. After the initial burst of the press talking about the great danger that the Japanese Americans were here and the danger of Japanese invasion, though the President of the United States and his people knew in great detail that the Imperial Japanese forces did not have the capability of invading the mainland of the United States. That did not stop them from talking about it all the time, and I mean the best of them. Edward R. Murrow, the great hero from the Battle of Britain, came back to the United States, gave a speech at his alma mater, Washington State University, and then at Washington University, and said that when the Japanese planes come to kill you, and they surely are coming, many of the pilots will be wearing University of Washington sweatshirts. He was the best and the brightest, and so was the most famous, one of the most famous editorial cartoonists in the country. Worked for PM in New York, who did, many of you have seen it, I think, and I think it is in the museum here, but did a powerful cartoon that showed little men in top hats and buck teeth and glasses coming down the West Coast to a single building on the coast where they were picking up friendly, I forgot all the words of it, but Friendly Dynamite Store was the name of this little place. And all of these Japanese, all through Washington, Oregon, California, were lined up all up the coast waiting to pick up their dynamite. And there was a man on top of the building, Japanese man, with a telescope, and the caption was, "Waiting for the signal from home," waiting for the signal of the Japanese to invade. The cartoonist's name was Theodore Geisel, although we probably know him better as Dr. Seuss. And part of the story is the California story, the racism, the greed. They're, after all, were white farmers, white fishermen, white businessmen who wanted the property and land either owned or controlled by Japanese Americans, and in general, they got it once the camps were open. But that was a level of what we laughingly call populism. Call it then, call it now. A plain old mixture of racism and greed and fear and ignorance. Those things never go away, even in the highest of places. But how did it get from that to having, Ku Klux Klan people and other great patriots attacking Japanese Americans? How did it get to the President of the United States? Franklin D. Roosevelt, a great man by any standard you pick. So the press story that I want to talk about here has to do with that. This is the way, this is where Executive Order 9066 came from. The single persons most responsible for it were General John DeWitt, who was the commander of the Fourth Army, the army on the West Coast. His headquarters were at the Presidio in San Francisco, who was both a fool and a bigot, and absolutely was convinced that there was no way to separate the Japanese. You could not learn what they were thinking, what they were doing. They simply were a foreign and a lesser race. The President of the United States, who believed in eugenics and was a racist, believed some of those same things, including the fact that he thought the problem with the Japanese and what made them aggressive was the shape of their skulls. And talking to people, eugenicists and people of that breed in that day and age, their leader was the head of the Smithsonian Institution, who told Roosevelt that it would take the Japanese 2,000 years to reach the mental level of Caucasians. And Franklin Roosevelt repeated that to people. But still, he didn't do anything about it until General DeWitt began preaching against the Japanese Americans, saying that they were all basically traitors. They were all part of the fifth column. They were all planning sabotage. And the politician who picked that up, man, who was then Attorney General and wanted to be governor of California, named Earl Warren. And it was Earl Warren who came up with the theory, which he posited in Washington before Congress a little later, but before that was telling his own people, district attorneys, et cetera, policemen in California, that the fact that there had not been a single act of sabotage by a Japanese American on the mainland of the United States was proof that they were under orders and were holding back for one giant strike. When the word that he was saying that, and he was a respected guy, as we know, got to Washington, the most powerful journalist in the country, Walter Lippmann, the greatest public intellectual in the country, a syndicated columnist appearing in the New York Herald Tribune, the Washington Post, and 200 other newspapers, came out to California, spent some time, just a day, with DeWitt and with Earl Warren. He then went back, he listened to what they had to say, took down word for word what Earl Warren told them, went back to Washington and wrote 2 columns in February of 1942. These are some of the things that the most distinguished journalist in America, the founder of the New Republic, the founder of Foreign Affairs, This is what he wrote in 200 newspapers. The Pacific coast is in imminent danger of a combined attack from within and without. It is a fact that there has been no important sabotage on the Pacific coast. From what we know about Hawaii and about the fifth column in Europe, this is not, as some would like to think, a sign there is nothing to be feared. It is a sign that the blow is well organized and that it is held back until it can be struck with maximum effect. Thank you, Attorney General Warren. Lippman went on to say, there is an assumption if the rights of a citizen are abridged anywhere, they have been abridged everywhere. He concluded nobody's constitutional rights include the right to reside and do business in the battlefield. There were people who argued with that, including the Attorney General of the United States, who compared those columns to armchair strategists and junior G-men yelling fire in a crowded theater. Whatever they thought of it, and whatever the one newspaper man in California, ironically, who said the Japanese should be left alone, we needed their brains, we needed the Japanese Americans, we needed their brains, we needed their labor, we needed everybody in this great war coming, was the publisher and the owner of the Orange County Register, was conservative paper in the state, Mr. Hoyles, who was the only person who consistently editorialized in my business against the incarceration of the Japanese. The important end to this little story is that 48 hours after Lippman wrote his two columns, Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066 because now he had the cover of not only the press, but of the liberal press and the establishment press as well. We all know what then happened next, and I will talk about it, I'm sure, in the panel, but the hysteria that started here with the press, and maybe with the worst people in the state, had spread across the country to Washington. Roosevelt signed the paper, used the word concentration camps, and said he didn't want to talk about this anymore, and created the War Relocation Authority, whose original director was Milton Eisenhower, the brother of of Dwight Eisenhower, who quit the job because he couldn't sleep or eat doing what he was doing. So that's how it began. And after the newspapers had their headlines, then came the notices to assemble, to go first to the relocation centers, and then on to the concentration camps in sealed trains. Sealed trains, the same way the Germans moved the Jews. So we have a lot to answer for in my business. Some of it was almost hilarious. Milton Caniff was a Greek cartoonist. He was the author, or whatever you call it, creator of Terry and the Pirates. In Life magazine, he did a set of drawings, Life magazine, then the largest publication in the country, on how to tell the difference between Chinese and Japanese. A lot of it had to do, in 2 full pages of Life magazine, with the distance between people's toes. It was Milton Caniff's conviction that the difference between Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, where the Japanese Americans wore more flip-flops, and therefore their big toe and the next toe would be farther apart than would be Chinese, who, after all, were our allies. I'm going to stop there, but I'm going to say, I want to tell one last story. This went on all through the war. And in general, there were some very good people. There are many very good people in this world, in this country. And and so that many farmers in California, fishermen, took care of the property of their former Japanese neighbors and watched over their houses. Sometimes it was a business deal. They promised to keep the property up, to keep it producing, and they would take half the profits, and the other half would be waiting when the Japanese were let out of the camps, and the ones serving in the 442nd and the 100th, the Nisei battalions, returned home. I want to tell you how something played out. There may be people here who know, but believe me, there ain't many people in other parts of the country who do, that the 442nd was given one of the most difficult jobs in the world, in northern Italy, in the war. At that time, we don't do it anymore, many military units were made up of people from the same area. What happened, if you saw Saving Private Ryan, was that suddenly in one family, 4 young men would be killed. Saving Private Ryan was trying to save the 5th brother because of the publicity that would follow if an entire family was wiped out. A good part of that story was based on the encirclement of the Texas Battalion, an all-Texan unit which was surrounded by Germans in the mountains in northern Italy and was being eliminated slowly. 3 times, the Americans tried to drive them out and were driven back. General Mark Clark then called on and assigned the 442nd and the 100th to try to rescue the Texas Battalion. And indeed, they did. Quite to the surprise of the Germans, who on occasion would say, well, you know, why are you capturing me? You're supposed to be on my side. The New York Times, in a long story on page 1, talked about the heroism of rescuing the Texas Battalion against some of the best forces and installations the Germans had. The headline and the copy never mentioned the word Japanese or Japanese American or Nisei or 442nd or 100th. It said that doughboys rescue Texas Battalion. Those same doughboys, who happened to be Japanese Americans, were the first Allied troops to reach Rome. And taking Rome was going to be the first great and public Allied victory of the war. And the people who first reached the outskirts of that great city was the 442nd and the 100th. They were ordered there to stop by the same General Mark Clark, and waited 2 days until truckloads of white soldiers could be brought up to drive into and conquer Rome. Meanwhile, the Japanese were Americans, soldiers all, Americans all, were loaded on the trucks and taken into the mountains where the Texas Battalion was was trapped. And it continued through the war and after the war. And two places I want to talk about, two stories that impressed me was a Nisi sergeant named Masuda was killed in Italy. It's also where Dan Inouye lost his arm. And he was killed, Matsuda was killed, he was from Anaheim, California. And the town council in Anaheim refused to let his family bury him in the town cemetery because he was Japanese. An American who had once served on the West Coast, the deputy commander of the Fourth Army, General Joseph Stilwell, Vinegar Joe Stilwell, heard about that. Masuda had been a great hero. He had won a Distinguished Service Medal, which is the second highest combat decoration in the U.S. Army. It was later elevated, along with 19 other DSCs, to the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is our highest honor, when in the 1950s, records were checked to read the citations that led. And citations for non-whites, whether they were blacks or Japanese Americans, that was noted, and they were down one rank, and not one rank, but one order in medals. Stillwell went to Anaheim and presented the Distinguished Service Cross to Masuda's sister, Mary Masuda, and then said, I am here from the United States Army. Sergeant Masuda will be buried with honors in your cemetery, or I will come back with pickaxe gangs of soldiers and take this town apart. Sergeant Masuda was buried. Actually, his birthday is honored each year now in that town. But that's the role that basically the press did to get us where we were in 1942. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Richard Reeves. Before I introduce our other panelists, I really would just like to take a moment to welcome the Consul General of Japan, Akira Chiba, who is with us, who's been a great friend, and we're very honored to have him. Thank you. So our next segment of the program is a panel, and we have quite an extraordinary panel. And I'm going to read you the bios of each of our speakers because I think that they have accomplished an enormous amount in their careers and they are extraordinarily well qualified to talk about this topic. So, of course, Richard Reeves, who we've already heard from, will join the panel. Davan Maharaj, who is the editor-in-chief and publisher of the Los Angeles Times. Davan oversees the largest daily news gathering organization in the West. It includes the flagship Los Angeles Times and LATimes.com, the Times Community News, and consists of 6 urban daily and weekly newspapers and websites, and the Spanish language Hoy and Fin de Semana newspapers and websites. During his 28 career at the Times, he's worked under the titles of Executive Vice President, Managing Editor, Assistant Foreign Editor, Deputy Editor for the Business Section, and a reporter in Orange County, Los Angeles, and East Africa. And in fact, Davan and our pathways didn't quite cross in East Africa, but once we got talking, we very quickly did that, 2 degrees of separation and realized how many people we know in common. And of course, you hear by my accent that I'm South African. Our next panelist is Karin Wang. Karin is the Vice President of Programs and Communications Communications at Advancing Justice LA. She oversees their programs, their pro bono program, and their communications work. And she's been active in local, state, and national organizations that seek to improve the legal system for immigrants and low-income communities. And in addition, she's been very involved in the struggle for marriage equality in California as the founding steering committee member of API Equality LA. She's also served as a past president of the Asian Pacific American Bar Association of Los Angeles County and a board member for various other legal associations. And then we also have with us someone who is also known to us, we've known for many years, the museum has, Naomi Hirahara, who's the Edgar Award-winning author of 2 mystery series set in Los Angeles. She's the former editor of the largest Japanese-American newspaper in the United States, the Rafu Shimpo. She's curated historical exhibitions and has written multiple fiction and non-fiction books, 2 biographies, which she wrote for the Japanese-American National Museum. And then her first Mas Arai novel, Summer of the Big Bachi, is currently being developed into an independent film. She's also working on a book on the struggles of Japanese Americans after being released from Manzanar concentration camp, which is to be published by Hay Books next spring. And then our moderator is none other than David Ono, who is the co-anchor of ABC 7 Eyewitness News at 4 and at 6 p.m. And since joining ABC 7 in 1996, David has witnessed history worldwide, covering everything from Hurricane Katrina to Haiti's earthquake to Japan's tsunami. He's traveled across Europe and Asia, chronicling brave acts of the Nisei soldiers from World War II. He attended the royal wedding in London. He tracked drug runners through Central America and reported from Paris on a terrorist plot to bring down the Eiffel Tower. He's also won 3 Edward R. Murrow Awards and 16 Emmys. So, folks, why don't you come back up to the stage? So, Davan, come first so that everybody knows who you all are. Davan and Karin, Naomi, David, and of course, Richard. Please come back.
Is it okay if I stand up here? Because I've got to spread some notes out here for a sec. And first of all, Anne, thank you so much. This is a beautiful facility. It's great seeing everybody here. And I feel honored to be here with our panelists and have this great conversation because it is eye-opening. Even for veterans of this issue and this story, to hear and read some of the old newspaper articles is really, it's moving and distressing, but most importantly, we gain some wisdom from all of it. And by the way, I don't know why I was at the royal wedding. I really do. I think that was a misfit. I probably shouldn't have covered that. Okay, so let's get to the conversation at hand. Mr. Reeves, he gave us some wonderful quotes and read from these various pieces and articles that were spread out throughout America, and you could kind of see and get that sense of how clearly steeped in prejudice, but also very, very much steeped in fear. And once journalists start writing these things that are clearly untrue, this particular one from the LA Times, February 19th, 1942, amazing details of the ramifications and methods of the Japanese spy system which operates in Los Angeles and other California communities have been collected by the House Committee investigating un-American activities. So when you read that as the first line of a story in your trusted newspaper, you could kind of see how suddenly, even if you're living next to these people, you start to distrust them. And you start to think, what if they are fighting for the enemy? What if they are in waiting? What if they are here to kill me? And so that's why honest and objective and accurate journalism is so important. So we start the conversation. I wanted to start with Davan because being in the huge position that you are in and hearing some of these headlines from, I mean, dare I say, your own paper, but granted, I'm not, blaming you by any means. But what are your initial thoughts when you hear about these horrible inaccuracies and that these inaccuracies led to 120,000 people and generations beyond that having their lives turned upside down?
Well, thanks, David. And I have to say, before I answer the question, I have to say, just listening to Richard speak makes me proud to be a journalist, and shows you why we need more people like Richard Reeves, who are truth tellers, but not just truth tellers, can dip back into history and correct the record in so many ways. So I think we're very fortunate to have someone like Richard with us on this stage, and I'm honored. So how do I feel? Well, first and foremost, I think I have to say that period, during that period was one of the most shameful periods of the Los Angeles Times, and I think we can so stipulate. Just a few months ago, I think within the last year, on the 75th anniversary of Korematsu, the Los Angeles Times editorialized about the fact that what a shameful act and period that was, and our complicity in that. And I think that just goes to show you the Los Angeles Times of now, and we are by no means perfect, and the Los Angeles Times back then, when they were in the service of the establishment. It also goes to show you, to answer your question directly, David, that when you want to, when there is a rise of populist anger and turmoil and hysteria, why you need a fearless, independent press, and why you need professional journalists who are not scared of the threats of any administration to be pushing back. Now, first and foremost, to be reporting the truth, but secondly, to be interpreting the facts that are gathered for people. So in those days, as Richard so accurately laid out, the press and good people like Walter Lippmann and Theodore Geisel and company. You look at the names, and Earl Warren, who later went on to become, an American hero who was part of the golden era of civil rights. But they were all captured by an establishment that wanted a certain outcome, and that's what happened.
Mm-hmm. Do you think? Yes, sir. And please, panelists, jump in if you have something to contribute.
I should have added, there's no doubt in my mind that the incarceration of the Japanese in the spring of 1942 led to Brown versus Topeka Board of Education in 1954, I believe it was. California has very extensive oral histories of its public servants. And Earl Warren's was taken over 6 days at Berkeley by a woman named Amelia Fry. And she tried to stay away from some subjects for as long as possible, but by then he was the retired Chief Justice of the United States. She said, Governor or Mr. Chief, I want to ask you about the events of the spring of 1942. Earl Warren broke into tears, stood up, walked out of the library, and never came back. So he knew.
One thing I wanted to jump in and just ask is, I think there's a fundamental question, like, who is this news outlet serving? Who's its audience? And I really feel like that, since the LA Times we've been talking about the LA Times, I don't think they were the paper of all Los Angelenos. Being that, here in Little Tokyo, we had like 4 newspapers. This is not a huge community, but there was just a need for, all this different points of view. And the Rafu Shimpo, where I worked, that started in 1903, they had an English language section, because you might think, oh, it's just because they couldn't speak English that well. They had an English section from the 1920s, So what did that mean? And then one of the co-editors of the 1940s, Togo Tanaka, a Nisei, brilliant. He graduated Hollywood High School, age 16. UCLA, age 19. He wrote for the Daily Bruin, graduated in poli-sci, there was no way he was going to get a job at any mainstream newspaper, you know. And so he works for the Rafu Shimpo. That is his only option. And then when I was looking on the AAJA, they have like an old-timers list or things about the history, right? Like I think the first Asian American, well, Japanese American journalist at the LA Times was like David Kishiyama, maybe. That was like 1960s. Like, I was born in the 1960s. I don't feel like it was kind of a long time ago, but it doesn't seem that long. But what I'm getting at is, you know, it wasn't, I mean, who were the people who are writing these articles? Not only that, who are the people like these columnists, right? Nobody was asking, hey, Togo, you work for Rafu Shimpo, why don't you write a column for, you know, in the LA Times in the 1940s?
Right.
They knew that something was up, the Rafu Shimpo, before Pearl Harbor happened. Togo Tanaka went to DC to petition, you know, they wanted to make sure that the newspaper could continue.
Yes.
They said no, it could not. So it stopped publication in April. There was only like newspapers that served Japanese American community. There were in the camps, but of course, you know, that's also, you know, the party line. But in Denver, there were some like 4 newspapers there. But it just showed you, okay, what happened? This is a great failure of the press.
Right.
You know, like, where was the Japanese American story? There was a paper in Bainbridge Island, and the journalists were very supportive. They had a correspondent in Manzanar, you know, who would, from Bainbridge Island, who would send stories. But generally speaking, these 120,000 people, they were not served by the press during that time.
Karin, go ahead.
Yeah, actually, I know we're focused here very importantly on sort of what happened in the days and months and I guess, you know, years even leading up to the incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans and the role of the media. But I think the question Naomi raises that I wanted to kind of use that just to mention like a parallel. Just, like, this was not the only time, obviously. I mean, I know we're going to get to, or at least all thinking about what this means in the age of a President Trump. But in preparing for this panel, what I found fascinating was this issue of the power, like who owns the media of the day, and what do they do with that power? Because you know, several decades before that, I actually in researching this, I was looking at the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I know it's the 75th anniversary this year of the signing of Executive Order 9066. May is also the 134th anniversary of the passage by Congress by a wide margin of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The first time a racial group was banned from coming to this country. The legacy continues today. Our immigration policy totally changed after that in 1882. And what was interesting is I found out that someone at Columbia Law School actually had done the analysis that I was curious about, which is someone actually went back and looked at all the media coverage in the San Francisco Chronicle, which at that time was the paper in the city with the largest Chinese population, to your point, in the US. And that paper ran 126 stories that year. 1 year, 52 weeks, 126 stories means an average of more than 2 stories a week, with over 1,000 references of negative references to Chinese immigrants. The main themes, and this person was like, you know, law students have a lot of time in their hands. Very exhaustive in cataloging economic threat, public health threat, criminal threat, the threat of invading the country through immigration, and more than 1,000 references of this. So, you know, and that really teed up, in many ways, it whipped up frenzy, not just of lynchings and beatings of Chinese, but the passage of this act. So, you know, we've done this time and time again. It is very much about who has the power over the media, who tells the stories, and whose stories get told. But, you know, with the Japanese American internment, definitely an example, but I thought it was really striking in preparing for this, just, you know, what happened several decades earlier, you know, with the Chinese Exclusion Act.
Right, similarities back then to
we didn't learn,
9066
obviously,
and-
from the Chinese Exclusion Act to the Japanese internment.
I've
So I think
probably
it's
read
really-
hundreds of those articles and papers, not only on the West Coast.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm forgetting someone, but my memory is that in not a single story was a Japanese American interviewed. All of
Interesting.
the news was from one direction.
So, you know, Richard, I think I don't know if you want to prolong this point,
please.
I think you can help us with some context of it, because the press was in the United States was only professionalized much later, right? And in those days, I know Harold Hoyts might have been the exception that you mentioned,
Right.
but in those days, the press largely existed to serve the interests of capital and the government.
Right.
Well,
We changed it.
Well, that's kind of where I wanted to lead with this conversation. The next step, I think, is analyzing then to now, and what's to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And I think first and foremost, we are here with Asian America Journalism Association. So this is an organization, like many others, that does promote diversity within a newsroom. And I think that diversity is invaluable, especially if you contemplate what a newsroom must have looked like back then in 1941, 1942, when they are vilifying Japanese and Japanese Americans, and there's not a soul to speak on their behalf within a newsroom and say you don't understand these people, and this is the wrong way to go. Whereas today, Davan, we have enormously more, better diversity. I wouldn't say it's perfect diversity, especially it's a case-by-case basis, but diversity is so important within a newsroom to bring different perspectives.
Well, I can speak to that because I was having a discussion with some colleagues before this meeting this afternoon, and I was saying, wow, I wonder what the newsroom must have looked like then. And I said, I bet it was just a bunch of white guys. And someone says, and I bet there were no women. And actually, I think that was true. I think it's also true that the Los Angeles Times very famously had to pull someone out of the, I think it was the advertising department, to help us cover the What's Rights in the 1960s. But since that, I think we've made a lot of strides in diversity. I think in the last 5-8 years alone, we've gone from a newsroom that, and admittedly it is a smaller newsroom than what it once was, but we've gone from a newsroom that was 20% non-white to now close to 35% non-white, and the 60-40 man to woman is something we're working on. Like you said, it's not perfect, but I can tell you a recent case, which everyone in this room knows about, shows you why you need people who are, have different points of views, can advocate points of views not on their own, but what they hear in real time, and bring it to the leadership of the paper. So we all know that this is another not our finest hour moment, put that in that category, when our traveler section printed a couple of letters from people. It was actually a well-meaning story about Tule Lake and important places to visit for our, in the civil rights of our. Thank you.
I'm a subscriber.
She came armed.
And I saved it. I wonder why I saved it.
But so there were a couple of letter writers who wrote in and actually said stuff that one of which went up on the screen, and in a very short space of time, I had folks in the newsroom say, "Hey, you got to deal with this," right? And it really made us up. We met with, and we'll tell you, folks from the museum and a delegation of folks in the community, and they impressed on us how serious it was, and we apologized, and not that put it right, but it showed that's an example of how much the newsroom had changed from having no one who can advocate that point of view, and hopefully you don't need someone of a particular race to do that, but
I think besides the diversification of the newsroom, it's like, who has the privilege of contributing an op-ed piece? Because I think a lot of that was actually from editorials that maybe other people had written, that Viper is a Viper. those of us who know Japanese American history, we hear that all the time. I wasn't quite sure who wrote it, so I looked it up, and it was like this W.H. Anderson. He might have been an attorney in L.A., so a man of privilege who was, I don't know if he initiated it or the editors initiated it, but this is like February 2nd. It was before the Executive Order 9066 when he wrote that particular essay. So I think these are the questions maybe for today, like who are the people who are asked to contribute their opinions, and who are these letters, like the 2 letters that were initially published were, I think, white people, and even later I think the responses, I don't think Japanese American letters were actually even published in response to that. So I think that's, this is one narrow case, but just a larger, in terms of other communities that are very vulnerable right now, are they getting a voice? Are they at the table, and are they able to tell their story from their point of view? That's my question.
Exactly. Eventually, I want to lead this, and we are going to open this up to questions from the audience as well. But I wanted to lead this to more modern day issues and the lessons we learned there that we can apply here. And Davan, thank you so much for basically talking about that incident with the LA Times most recently. It's good to hear what happened internally at the LA Times, but externally, when we hear those comments from people still out in the public, there's still greatly a misunderstanding or a lack of understanding on what exactly happened back then. And it tells us that this chapter is vitally important as we forge ahead with our current world. I just recently spoke in Bentonville, Arkansas at a film festival. And I found it interesting because what I loved about it, I loved coming here and speaking, but you guys are educated, you know this chapter in history. In Arkansas, when I look out into the audience, it's a bunch of white people, but I was encouraged because we showed a documentary on internment, and then I led a panel discussion afterwards, but the first question I asked them was, how many people have heard about this chapter in American history where Japanese Americans were put in these concentration camps? And less than half the audience raised their hand. So there's an absolute lack of knowledge when it comes to this chapter, as Richard pointed out. And you'd think in this day and age, as we continue to analyze these situations, as we go into the current situation with our world today, in America today, that more and more people will talk about this, and I hope it does. Maybe that's a byproduct of what we're dealing with. But I want to bring the conversation into the world of fear and hate, because I feel like when we saw the quote up there in that film piece, and it basically, in a nutshell, said, I'll infringe on the rights of 1 million people to save one boy. And I feel like Americans have this understanding that when it comes to keeping their families safe and them fearing a certain segment of the population, that Americans still believe it's okay to infringe on innocent people's rights as long as they can say, I'm doing it to keep my family safe. Karin, I wanted you to kind of, I know this is kind of an esoteric conversation here, but I wanted you to talk a little bit more about, you have been seeing, your organization has been seeing a rise in these kinds of hate crimes, especially with the political rhetoric that's out there, in particular with Asian communities.
Yeah, thank you, David. And so the rise in hate is definitely not specific to the Asian or Asian Pacific Islander communities. In general, I think everyone probably knows there has been a noticeable spike, at least in the coverage and reporting and public telling of hate attacks. What David and I have actually talked a lot on and off about over the last couple of months is that there is also a concurrent rise against many Asian communities that is not getting equal coverage. And I do think media coverage and rhetoric actually is feeding into a lot of that. So for example, in Los Angeles, I don't know if you know this, but in fall of last year, data came out around the rise in hate crimes in 2015. So that was before the presidential election campaigns really got underway, but presidential campaigns launched in the summer of 2015. I think, in fact, I was able to find at the time a copy of now President Donald Trump's speech that he made in July when he announced his candidacy. It actually now has been, I just looked again today, it's been deleted off his website. I think he purged a lot of things off his website recently. But what was interesting when I looked at it earlier was that in July, when he announced his running for the presidency, he was among several candidates who made a lot of comments about China, and specifically calling out China as an economic threat. And in that particular speech, he kind of packaged, Mexico as a threat, ISIS as a threat, and China as a threat all together. And so what was interesting is there's actually been a decline in anti-Asian violence for some time. In fact, hate crimes overall has been on the decline in California and the U.S. for 7 or 8 years. But in 2015, which is the most recent year we have full year data for so far, hate crimes started going back up. California jumped 10%, LA jumped 24%. Anti-Asian hate violence actually tripled, jumping, I think it was more than tripled. Most of those were against people perceived to be Chinese. And we don't have we can't prove it, but our feeling in terms of monitoring this over the years is that there is a correlation between rhetoric, between things that were being printed in the press, things that were being said in debates, being covered extensively on Fox News and all cable channels, and a lot of it was centering on demonizing immigrants, including Asian immigrants. So in general, there is a very strong correlation between what gets reported in the media, which now is proliferated beyond the LA Times to television to social media, and the consequences of what gets put out there, whose stories are told. And it's the stories, even with social media, still privilege, I think, not the marginalized communities.
Mm-hmm. Naomi, since we have you here and you have experience with the Rafu, I wanted to throw this quickly out there. When it comes to the generation that dealt with this, Japanese Americans that were in the camps, the Rafu is directly connected to them. In your experience, how did it ever come up? Did anybody talk about how they were unfairly treated by the press or the media or newspapers in general?
I think there was so many other things that were kind of on their plate that I'm sure it was just like a given that it was out there. But one thing to piggyback on what you said, and I'm going to put this out there for a call to action for AAJA, because I think you're right. There's a lot of people, and we have new people who don't know much about the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And I thought it was interesting how Professor Reeves, you use concentration camp. This is an issue of words, and I think this needs to be a discussion in the newsroom, because what I would keep seeing when this became such a political thing in this election, Japanese Americans incarceration, they would say Japanese internment.
Yes.
And with social media too, a lot of times the headline gets shortened and says Japanese internment. And I think this is the place, right? The Japanese American National Museum, you had an exhibition, America's Concentration Camp. So I think it's really important to drive. Now, not all journalists are going to go for that, but I think it's worth AAJA struggling over and maybe putting out a bulletin to newsrooms. These are the things you should consider when you report on this.
It is interesting that you say that. And by the way, Professor Reeves here did say that Roosevelt himself used the word concentration camp when he signed 9066.
Concentration camp, of course, the words took on a different meaning.
Right.
Yes,
as we know.
Once the tragedy, the Holocaust occurred, and I know when it comes to the Jewish community, they do take issue. But then if we, there is conversation on this about how perhaps death camp is better fitting for them and concentration camp, because the Japanese American concentration camp.
There was another internment.
It
was with the Department of Justice.
I will say it is a debate that does come up. A lot of people still feel very uncomfortable using the term concentration camp. My own boss, I hope she doesn't get angry at me, not that she'll ever see this, so if you burned that video, but when I released Heart Mountain and we did a promo piece on it on our news, and she checked the promo, how I wrote it up, and I used an American concentration camp. And she says, but most people don't. She goes, I disagree with that term, and let's change it to internment camp. And I said, well, before you do that, let me just explain to you how the Japanese American community feels about that one term versus the other. And she says, I understand what you're saying. I disagree with you, and I'm the boss. So we ran it. Then my email got inundated, and I forwarded every single one to her. And I will tell you, she was very forthcoming immediately, saying that I get it, I understand now. And if we insult an entire community for the use of a word, then we stop using that word. But sometimes you have to teach people the hard way, and it is difficult. It's difficult for people to absorb concentration versus internment camp.
Well, there's like detention, incarceration. You could take baby steps to get there.
Right.
Like your boss, I've been kicked around by a number of people using the word internment, which of course is wrong. Internment is something that is done with enemy aliens. These people were not aliens, most of the people in the camps. However, in the cover of my book, I went the same way that your boss went. Internment is understood by, I mean, there's an academic argument, there's an argument within the community, but the truth of the matter is that most people think the word internment, the people who know anything.
But that's why I feel like what you said is so important, that President Roosevelt used the term when he signed the paper, and that says it all. They may change the term for it to make it more digestible for American people when it was happening, but we know what it was, and people lived in it.
An awful lot of magazine coverage and whatnot, which made it seem like a summer camp.
Right.
It was as if it was the world's largest Grossingers or something.
Okay, so we're probably I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions now, because the questions I have, probably you have as well. So, and that way we stay close to on time here. So may I ask anybody out in the audience, do you have a question for the panel? Yes, ma'am.
Well, this particular audience, I feel, pretty well knows the background. And given the nature of this Trump administration and the climate, I think we should have begun there, in a sense, because so much of this history, even the subtle, I've been to too many events at the Japanese American National Museum not to know how much ground they have covered, just about all of it, in terms of this kind of thing. Where do we go from here? I'm more focused now on resistance, really. And I'm very fortunate to live in Echo Park, which is a very, very active community. And I've been to about 4 churches now, going to their genuine wanting to concretize what does it mean to be a sanctuary church? How do we protect the immigrants? And I'm up the block from the Episcopalian Cathedral. The diocese is located there. And the particular provost, Frank Alton, there are meetings that we now have a little group. Well, they have had meetings on this. They've had how to do civil disobedience. And I work for the ACLU. I'm a volunteer. And there's a publication that they were in my car. I should have brought them. Know Your Rights, when stopped by the FBI, the police, ICE, and the agents. And to focus on what we do to resist. We know what we're in. Everyone in this audience is here because we know. And how do we challenge it constructively, creatively, and in an interesting way?
Right. And what you say, I'm sure everybody here understands. I think that clearly, first and foremost, what we believe is important is how examining the media from back then does help us. Yeah, I get it. I know. You make a great point. You're beautifully said. being a journalist is a very complicated thing, especially today, when you want to remain objective, but still point out problems or issues with the current administration. So I'm going to throw it to the boss, Davan, because this is, how do you deal with your job every day when it comes to dealing with these kinds of issues that she just brought up and trying to maintain objectivity in this world that we live in?
So, I'll answer that question, two ways. But before I do, I want to say that yes, we are all, as journalists, we are all mindful of objectivity. We're all mindful of fair reporting, and we are all mindful also of the times that we're in. And how do you apply that to what we see that's happening in the country? But I think we also have to ask ourselves, as journalists and as citizens, what side of history do you want to be on, right? What did you do when all of these things were happening? And in preparation for this panel, I went back and read some of the letters that followed the letters in our traveler section. And this one really struck me because it addressed that. And David, if you would indulge me, I would love to. It's only like 5 paragraphs, but this was a writer from Karin Del Mar who was moved to write. When on December 8, 1941, our teacher in mechanical drafting at Woodrow Wilson Junior and Senior High School in El Sereno let us gather around his radio to hear President Roosevelt's declaration of war on Japan, I gazed back to look at Willie. Willie was one of the most popular kids in our 8th grade class. He also happened to be Japanese. While the rest of the class gathered around the radio, I noticed that Willie remained hunched over his drafting table. He understood that Japan, the country of his parents' ancestry, had attacked his country, and he was devastated and ashamed. Later, we found out that Willie would be leaving us. He and his parents were being sent away to a detention camp. Our teacher let us give Willie a farewell party. Some weeks later, I recall standing with my parents and hundreds of others on Huntington Drive adjacent to the Pacific Electric streetcar tracks as train after train of red cars loaded with frightened-looking Japanese men, women, and children rolled by. We stood there in silence and did nothing. Even today, 75 years later, I look back in shame. Martin A. Brower, Colonel Del Mar.
That's beautiful.
So, how do we do our jobs as journalists? Well, first and foremost, I think what we have to do is we have to report the news and report it fairly and accurately. And I think, as you see, that there has been an effort with, to delegitimize the media,
right?
And to call the media enemies of the people. Mm-hmm. Maybe, well, we could only guess, but maybe so that when the media reports on stuff that is truthful and painful to others, that you can say, there you go, see, it's fake news. So, but I think as you see what's been happening since in this administration, you have the professional press breaking story after story about potential corruption, malfeasance, abuse of power, and things like that. So I think without doubt you can see that the professional press is largely working. Second, you have to. It's also the media's response. So we like the New York Times and the Washington Post and other outlets. We are trying to do that on a daily basis. At the same time, too, you have to analyze what's happening and for readers. And in the 70-something day of the administration, our editorial board decided to, that they had seen enough, and they decided to write a series of editorials, beginning with one headline, "Our Dishonest President." The editorial board had already editorialized before the election that if Donald J. Trump was elected, it could be a catastrophe. But one line stuck with me in that first editorial, which was, even though we said it might be a catastrophe, nothing prepared us for the magnitude of this train wreck, right? And so the editorial board took on published a 6-part editorial, and I have to say that the response to that was largely, was overwhelmingly positive. During the publication of that, we also opened up a line for people to call in, and I thought, oh my God, we at the LA Times are familiar with phenomenon, practice, when you publish a story, and especially if there's a Latino name in the story, you have a bunch of haters who come out and just, criticize members of our staff for including people in stories, and really not only dehumanizing but demonizing the reporters and the subjects of the articles. But in response to that call out, we found that the people who call in, and hundreds of them did, the responses were largely positive, right? And I was like, wow. And so it dawned on me that the LA Times, through its analysis of the administration so far, had provided had articulated what many people were feeling, right? So, I can go on and on, but this is one of the most important time in the history of our country with what we're seeing right now. And the press, I think, has to be a vanguard for protecting people's rights, for speaking truth to power, and for telling the whole story.
If I can ask you just a very brief follow-up, because we are AAJA, if we have journalists in the room, and if they asked you the question, how do I do my job, maintain objectivity, but then get vilified by one side, by half this country? How do I deal with being vilified for telling the truth? What do you tell them?
Well, first I would say it's not half the country, but I know it's a significant and part of the country. But two, I think if you're a journalist, one, no one wants to be vilified, no one wants to be attacked, no one wants to be threatened, or body slammed, right? At the same time, I have to almost caution myself to say this, but that right now, that's the part of being a journalist in America, and it does call upon a lot of courage to do that. Mm-hmm. And so we as journalists have to summon all the courage we have to do this very important job right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, Karin.
As one, I think, non-journalist up here, and as someone whose professional job is to resist, my job was not to resist until November 8th, but everything changed on that next morning. But I actually really just wanted to commend the Los Angeles Times for its editorial series, because I think that being objective, I think to me, at least from where I sit, doesn't necessarily, you have to speak truth, like you said, and truth isn't necessarily neutral. So I think what's amazing and beautiful in that editorial series was really, telling the truth, which unfortunately is very ugly right now. And it does challenge a person and an administration which is in power, but it's so incredibly important to the larger resistance, the people at the ACLU, the people at my organization, Advancing Justice, to also see where the media is playing a role in that resistance, not because you're part of the resistance, but because that the truth is very important to say right now.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, Daryl.
Hi, David. Hello. A lot of you guys know me. Let me just throw out my JA bona fides. The interesting thing about me and my family is my dad was born right next door to this building. He climbed that tree. I've performed here. I've worked for Go for Broke right next door, Grateful Crane, Manzanar Committee, Heart Mountain Foundation, and with you, David Ono, and I happen to work at the LA Times. I just wanted to corroborate what Davan Maharaj was saying. The Times has changed a lot. Something that I do is I meet a lot of people and I talk about the history of the paper, history of the city, and try to debunk things like the Chinatown belief. The movie's great, but what happened with water was not Chinatown. And the red cars didn't disappear according to Roger Rabbit the way it was portrayed in the movie. And the paper has changed so much I'll tell you about a memo that Harry Chandler, the second publisher, wrote to his editor, L.D. Hotchkiss. On the 60th birthday of the LA Times in 1941, December 4th, 3 days before Pearl Harbor, Harry Chandler received felicitations from the Japanese community. Publisher Komai sent a very nice letter. And Harry Chandler, in response, sent a memo to his editor, Hotchkiss, saying, there's no reason to attack the Japanese community. They're bending over backwards to show their loyalty and their patriotism. The winner of the oratorical contest was John Iso, who would become Judge John Iso, a fine young man from Los Angeles. And so Harry Chandler was saying, for the time being, things are okay. So let's not attack them for any reason that's unnecessary. The response to the letters in the travel section, I think, is a feather in the Times cap. And now and then, even though I'm not an editorial, I sometimes get asked about, hey, is this right in this story from an editor? And I'll say, well, let me think about that one, and I'll give my response. And they will listen. In the 1960s newsroom, it was a white newsroom. David Kishiyama was probably the first Asian American journalist, followed by somebody like Ed Sakamoto. There was one woman in the newsroom in the mid-60s, Dorothy Townsend, about 4'10", and she argued with her editors to be sent down to cover tough things like the Watts riot. And yes, the guy from, I believe, advertising was a black man. We didn't have a black reporter. And he was given a pocket full of change, and he made phone calls back to the paper. There were no cell phones, young people. But my 40th year comes up in June, and I can tell you this, that if the Times was the same paper that it was back in those days, I couldn't have worked there that long. My personal honor would not let me. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. He's a soundbite machine, as you could probably tell. He was beautiful in our Heart Mountain documentary. Let's do one more question, and then I think we're probably pretty much out of time. Anybody out there have a final for us? Oh, bunch of
I'd like to make a final comment then.
Yes, ma'am.
Tomorrow at Barnstable Park, there's the first day, Ramadan begins, and the Muslim community is having this public event for Ramadan at Barnstable Park. If you know where it is, Vermont and Hollywood Boulevard, in the park up there, Hollyhock House, William Roy Light, and all that. Do go.
All right. Thank you so much.
Sundown.
Since we're making announcements, well, is Ashley here? Ashley Dunn? He was here. Oh, Ashley's way up there. He's the president of AAJA LA, and he's a new president, and he's done a remarkable job, and he's also with the LA Times, so he helped set this up. And so if you want to talk to him about AAJA, Ashley's here. We're actually going to have another event here on June 8th, Nick Ut Beyond the Napalm Girl. So that will be really fascinating. If you're familiar with Nick Ut, he's the Associated Press photographer who took the Napalm Girl photo. I actually had the privilege of going back to Trang Bang where he took that for the 40th anniversary of that photo. And he's going to be here talking about his remarkable career, because that was just the beginning of his career. What he's done here in LA is really amazing. And it's like going through time again with him and all the court cases he's done and all the big issues that have happened here in Los Angeles. So that's going to be coming up here. Again, thank you, Ann, for hosting us for that. But to all the panelists, you guys, thank you so much. I appreciate it. You have so much wisdom. And to the LA Times especially, thank you for courageously coming out, kind of exposing the problems that are the mistakes that you made in the past, and then talking about how we are fixing the problem. And Mr. Reeves, thank you so much. Your wisdom has been spectacular. Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.